It is said that people returning from the fairy realm are never the same after. They have what's called a spirit look, especially if they have listened to fairy music. For the fairy music is soft and low and plaintive, with, it is said, a fatal charm for mortal ears. One day, a man entered a cabin in the County Clare and saw a young girl about 20 seated by the fire, chanting a melancholy song without settled words or music. On inquiry, he was told she had once heard the fairy harp, and those who hear it lose all memory of love or hate and forget all things and never more have any other sound in their ears save the soft music of the fairy harp. And when the spell is broken, they die. G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. Have you ever wished to hear fairy music? I know I have. Even being aware of the risks, I fear that I couldn't resist the temptation should it ever present itself to me. And make no mistake, listening to or even just overhearing fairy music can be very dangerous. I have some incredible true tales of fairy music for you, both old and new. And we find that no matter the year that they took place, these encounters are eerily similar. The final story in this video is one of the most haunting fairy encounters I've ever heard. But let's begin with these 3 stories that suggest that sometimes fairies reveal their music to a person or people as a forewarning of something to come. One night, around the time of the full moon in September of 2017, I had my windows open because it was so nice and cool. Just as I was getting into bed, I heard a strange sound off in the distance outside. I stopped moving so that I could hear it better, since I was making sounds moving the blankets, and after about 5 seconds, it came back. I went over to the window so that I could hear it better. I got right up to the window screen and listened. To my amazement, it sounded like a flute being played outside somewhere. I was dumbfounded. It wasn't just a flute though. It sounded mysterious. The strangest thing about it was the music. It wasn't complicated, but it was still somehow strange and mysterious. The melodies didn't last long, probably less than 10 seconds. Then it started again, and each time was a different melody, and they were just weird, simple melodies with rapid back and forth notes at times. Each time it started back up, it sounded like it was coming from somewhere else, like whoever was playing it was walking around outside. I thought about going out on the front step and possibly walking around looking for it. I was mesmerized, but I was also a bit concerned. I had no clue what it was. I was just thinking to myself, wow, am I really hearing this? I've never heard anything like it before. I paid particular attention to the melody. The only melody that I remember was the last clear one that I could hear. and I can still remember that melody. I was being cautious because I had no idea really what it could be, but still I really wanted to go out and check it out. It didn't feel scary, but I am a really careful person. I always think about worst case scenarios, like stepping out on the front steps only to have my soul sucked away by whatever or whoever it was. But eventually I did give in to my curiosity and I opened the front door a wee bit and I peeked out and I listened. I couldn't hear it anymore at this point, but I waited there, looking out into the dark neighbourhood, trying to see if I could catch anything moving at least, but I didn't. Finally, when I felt that the threat level was low, I stepped out onto the front step. I was prepared to scurry back inside in a split second if I had to, but as I stood there, I happened to look right at a window of a neighbour's house across the street. There was this white streak of light that went one way, then quickly turned around and went back the other way, and then it vanished. I also remember smelling apples when I was listening by the window before I went outside. I had been melting some scented wax that evening, but it was an apple. I have no clue what to think about that strong smell. So I was left with an odd feeling about the whole thing. Oh, and I'm not sure if this was linked to that music that I heard, but the very next night I ended up being rushed to the emergency room because of a severe pain in my right side. All the Year Round was a Victorian periodical, a British weekly magazine founded and owned by Charles Dickens and published between 1859 and 1895. This extraordinary tale comes to us from County Limerick and was published in All the Year Round in 1870. A banshee was traditionally attached to the Bailey family of Lochgur, and one night, at the dead of night, when Miss Kitty Bailey was dying of consumption, her two sisters, Miss Anne Bailey and Miss Susan Bailey, who were sitting in the death chamber, heard such sweet and melancholy music as they had never heard before. It seemed to them like distant cathedral music. The music was not in the house. It seemed to come through the windows, high in the air. But when Miss Anne, who went downstairs with a lighted candle to investigate the weird phenomenon, had approached the ruined castle, she thought the music to be coming from above the house, and thus perplexed and at last frightened, she returned. Both sisters are on record as having distinctly heard the fairy music playing for a long time that night. Their sister, Kitty Bailey, died at dawn. I haven't heard it in a long time, but I've heard unexplained music before. When I was in my early to mid-20s or so, I'd hear it now and then. I'd hear it in different places, and it would fade in, get really loud, and then fade out, and no one seemed to notice it. The music itself was beautiful. It had a flute and chime-like quality to it. At least, that's the best way I can think of to describe it. The tune was kind of meandering and hard to remember, and I always closely associated it with fairies because around that time period I had many fairy-related dreams. It was definitely an interesting, memorable experience. We know there is joy to be found in music, and some believe that music can actually heal. But could it be possible that fairy music can restore life? Take a look at this incredible story from Donegal. It is said that the fairies were very common in Ireland long ago, but few seem to see them now. Not so very long ago, fairies were heard in Ballysaggett, some miles from Killybegs. There was a holly bush which grew in a garden belonging to a man who said that it had been there for as long as his father and his grandfather could remember. One night there was a great storm and the bush was uprooted. Some neighbours gathered and tried to set the bush right again, but they could not lift it, no matter how they tried. So they had to leave it, and the man who owned it was said to be very sad. But that night, when he was in bed and asleep, he was wakened by lovely music which would enchant anyone, but he thought that he was only imagining it. The next morning, when he got up, he saw a crowd of people standing where the bush was. When he went out and inquired what was wrong, he was told that everyone had heard fairy music during the night, and when they came there, they found the bush planted, and no one could point out where the tree had been lifted from or where the soil was broken to put it down again. Then he recalled to mind what he had heard that night, and they came to the conclusion that it was the fairies who replanted it, and also that it must be a fairy bush. Ample other stories of people's lives being ruined in various ways because they dared to listen to fairy music. And I'm going to show you some of those creepy stories in a minute. But first, let's look at two encounters involving fairy music that show us the lighter side of some fairies. One time, a man was going home from his ceilidh. It would be between 11 and 12 o'clock in the night. He was going by a fort and he suddenly heard lovely music. He knew it for the music of a fiddle. He stopped and immediately the music stopped. He moved on and the music started again. Then he heard the fairies' laughter coming from the fort. One night my uncle, John Gallagher, was coming home from visiting. He had a fiddle with him. His brother was with him too, and another boy. Well, on nearing their home, they heard fairy music coming from a little hill near the road. At last, the music sounded at the very road they stood, and the boys fearlessly began to dance to it. My uncles went on to their house, still dancing, and the music followed them. It would cease occasionally, and laughing and talking would take its place before the music started up again. My uncles reached their house, and while they were stood waiting for the door to be opened for them, a host of little red men went marching through a rushy field beside their house. So there you have it. In a quest for balance, there are two examples of fairies sharing their music and some fun times with us, perhaps tempting us to think that if we do stumble upon fairy making music, as long as we didn't interfere, we just might glide through the experience unharmed. Might is the key word there. We know that fairy music is alluring. It captures our attention immediately. People are known to literally drop whatever they are doing, stop wherever they are going when they hear fairy music on the air. We also know that while we are on occasion permitted to hear fairy music, it is never ours to keep. There will be a price to pay, and this payment can take many forms, so we must keep our wits about us. Before an accident happens to a boat or a death by drowning, low music is often heard, as if coming from under the water, along with harmonious lamentations. And then everyone in the boat knows that some young man or beautiful young girl is wanted by the fairies, and so doomed to die. The best safeguard is to have music and singing in the boat, for the fairies are so enamoured of the mortal voices and music that they forget to weave the spell till the fatal moment has passed, and then all in the boat are safe from harm. I'm a Native American that lives in Oklahoma. Growing up, my grandmother would tell us stories. One of the stories was that her father was walking in the woods one day and a little person came up to her father and was trying to lure him deeper into the woods. Her father completely ignored the little person and just went on like it wasn't even there. My grandmother said these little people do in fact exist, and they are evil. If you ever encounter one, she said, you're supposed to ignore them and just go about your way. They will do anything to try and lure you with them, including trying to entice you with their beautiful music. Many years ago, there lived a man called Pat Clark. He made his living by playing his fiddle at country ceilidhs. One dark night, as he was coming home from a ceilidh, he heard some beautiful music, and as he walked on, he met a man who was playing a violin. He was playing a beautiful tune, and Pat, who had a good ear for music, soon learned it. When he was about a mile from home, he heard a slight noise behind him, and on looking round, he saw a little fairy who told him not to play that tune at any time or in any place. One night, years later, Pat went to a ceilidh in a neighbouring house. Well, there was another fiddler there who boasted that he could play more tunes than Pat. Although Pat was not a man for bragging, he would not admit that the other man could play better than he, so the two men started playing. They played and played, but at last Pat could not think of a tune to play other than the fairy tune he knew. So, rather than call himself beaten, he played it. When he finished it, a terrible thing happened. A crowd of fairies rushed into the house and took Pat away. No one has seen or heard of him since. A man was returning home from a fair one night, and he had to pass by this rath. On passing it, he heard the loveliest music ever played. He listened for a time and then joined in humming with the fairy music. Well, this interrupted the fairies, and when the man was about to pass by, a tiny man jumped out before him. This little man kept running before him as he walked, and finally the man gave up and lay down, saying he couldn't proceed. He fell asleep, and when he wakened, he found that his hair had been cut off. The man was bald ever after, and he believed that the fairy cut off his hair while he was asleep as punishment for humming their music. A great many accounts of hearing fairy music occur nearby forts. Forts are circular earthen mounds which form a kind of enclosure, and most all fairy music is heard in forts at night. So if you fear the whim of the fairies and want to avoid accidentally hearing fairy music, steer well clear of their forts or raths, particularly at night, for the night belongs to the fairy, and forts are a favourite for their gatherings. In olden times, the police resided in the village of Windgap. The ruins of their barracks are still to be seen. Well, on a certain occasion, a man in Windgap had committed a terrible crime, and the police were in search of him. Now, by some means, they got word that he was in Ballyock this night, and a sergeant and a few of the police set out to find him. They had to pass by Kiltrassy, in which there was a fairy rath. They had passed it when going to this place, but had not seen anything. When they were returning home about midnight, and as they were passing the moat, the sergeant noticed a beautiful castle where the moat should be. He showed it to his friend and asked them if they had ever seen it before, and he told them that he himself had never seen it. The castle windows were beautifully lit up by coloured lights. There was a half door on it and a gate leading into it. In front of the castle were all sorts of beautiful flowers growing. They could hear from within men and women singing and dancing and fairy music playing. The men went up to the castle, up to the window, and looked in. Then they went over to the hall door, and as the sergeant was putting up his hand to open the door, the whole castle disappeared, leaving the sergeant and his companions terrified. They quickly went home, and the following day they told their tale to the people of the village. The people only laughed at them, saying it was only the good people who were enjoying themselves. One autumn day, there was a man on the side of a fort minding his cattle. He was not long there when he heard the music coming to him on the wind. He listened, and he thought he never heard such sweetness before. He had a great desire to learn the tune, and he spent a long time on the fence listening. He did not feel the time slipping, and at the end of it was that it was very late at night when he started for home, and he had to go through a stubble field to get there. He pulled the stubble out of the ground and began to play the fairy tune. As soon as he got home, he went in, sat in the corner, and started to play the tune again. He was not long there when he heard a knock at the door, and an old, small, grey person stuck in his head and said, "Do something for me. Stop the music, or it will leave you a present for life." After saying just that much, the man disappeared again as if the ground had swallowed him. The following night, the same thing happened, but the man paid as much attention to the advice as he had the first night. The third night, he continued the music again and gave a deaf ear to the old man who was foretelling him his own good. So it was, on that third night, the man went to bed some time before midnight, and the following morning there was nothing there but his shadow. His health was broken. He had no life in his bones. Only then he understood that he had got this present on account of the fairy music. "It is a pity," said he, "that we do not pay attention to good advice." He spent the remainder of his life thinking of that. I think it's safest to say that most of the time, fairy folk are not well pleased for humans to overhear their music. This last encounter comes from the wild and wonderful County Donegal, and for me serves as a reminder that fairy music can be as dangerous as it is captivating. In a glen near Moville there once lived fairies. The principal amusement during the winter night of fairies residing there in their snug, comfortable thatched houses was dancing and fiddling. One clear midsummer night, a goodly company of young people were gathered in a house for a night's amusement. The fiddler for the occasion was a noted favourite who always gave of his best on all occasions. After partaking of a hearty supper made up of homemade bread, butter, and jam with sweet milk, the party was seated round a bright peat fire, cracking jokes or listening to tales of heroism told by the old couple of the house. Just at midnight, the faintest music was heard. So beautiful it was that the fiddler was visibly moved and thrown into an ecstasy. His eyes shone like brilliant stars. His body trembled while his hands clenched tightly his beloved fiddle. All the company looked on and appeared to be greatly frightened at the appearance of their beloved fiddler. Not a word did he utter, but listened with rapt attention as the music drew nearer and sounded sweeter. All believed that it could not be produced by any mortal person. No one but the fairies could bring out such delightful notes on a violin. Suddenly, the fiddler arose, his face all aglow. He rushed to the door and out into the open night. All voices could be heard calling on the fiddler to stop, but still the music continued. although it grew fainter and fainter. The fiddler followed the fairy music. The people could hear the fairy music and the fiddler's voice calling, and by the light of the moon the people saw the fiddler climbing up a mountain until he was lost to view. That was the last sight they ever had of their beloved fiddler, as he was never seen or heard of again. Never seen or heard of again. Can you imagine this young man, so talented and popular in his community, and probably a very important member of his family too, just gone, entirely overcome by the sound of the fairy music? He lost all thought, all will. He could not be persuaded. He had no choice but to follow that music. My sense of this is that the fairies knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted him and knew how to get him. But why did they want him, Kitty? I can hear you asking. Well, of course, it's anybody's guess, but perhaps it was for his musical ability, perhaps for his charm or his looks, or perhaps a fairy wanted to take him for a lover, or just maybe he was a fairy born, and that can explain his exceptional talent and the calling to return. At any rate, he did go willingly. Isn't this a fascinating one? If you enjoy exploring fairies as much as I do, please consider joining me as a member of the channel. It's easy to do, and you're not only supporting the channel, but you get special treats too, like early access and your name on every video. Just check out the link in the notes below. Remember, I post a new video every second Friday. But I have loads of videos, so if you feel you need more fairies in your life, just go back and check out some of my earlier videos. I just know you'll love them. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio.